Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm going to be your host for this episode of Cut the Crop. And today we're going to be talking about pollinating seed crops. And you might be asking, why are we talking about that at this time of the season? And the reason that we are is because if you were thinking of using alternative pollinators, then you actually have to start thinking about preparing things in advance, and this is a good time to be thinking about it. And so today we've got Brad Howlett from Plant and Food Research, and he's going to be explaining to us what the opportunities are for alternative pollinators. Welcome, Brad.
Kia ora, Alison. It's great to be here to talk about other pollinators as well as the honeybees as well.
Yeah. So let's just talk about, how did your work come about? Why did Plant and Food and FAR and the seed industry decide that they wanted to have explore other options other than honeybees?
So other insects actually play quite a valuable role in the pollination of a range of crops. Currently, growers of the seed industry as well as various insect pollinated crops around New Zealand rely heavily on honeybees. Now, being reliant on just one pollinator has potential risks involved. So if we had a disease that might come in, then it could have a big impact on the management of honeybees. But there's also a range of other insects that are just as good as honeybees for pollination. Some are actually better, and some pollinate when honeybees aren't doing the job properly under the cool, cloudy conditions.
So what options are there? What are these other insects that you've been looking at?
Okay, so firstly, a lot of people recognise that wild bees can play an important role. So they've been a major focus overseas. New Zealand has a range of, firstly, introduced species like bumblebees that are actually very good pollinators of crops like white clover and red clover. In fact, growers might actually put long-tongued bumblebees on their red clover because they do so much a better job than honeybees on that crop. But as well as that, we've got some native bees that nest in the soil. Species of a genera called Leiophroctus are actually very good pollinators. And certain native bees are good for the pollination of particular crops like white clover. Others are good at pollinating carrot and onion. But apart from those bees, we also have a lot of non-bee pollinators as well. Interestingly, these haven't gained the attention of bees, but they can be very effective pollinators as well. And this is one area I think there's a lot of potential to be able to make better use of those insects for pollination.
So you do have one particular project that you've been working on with FAR, looking at drone flies. So tell us, what's a drone fly and why did we choose that to sort of have some research trials on?
Yeah, okay. So the drone fly is a type of hoverfly. Hoverflies are very good pollinators. The drone fly is a particularly interesting one. A lot of people can't actually tell it apart from the honeybee. So it's actually a honeybee mimic. One of the good things about that is that, it's an effective pollinator like the honeybee. It also has a very simple life cycle. So, you can mass rear it in large numbers using just really easy to obtain substrates to get large numbers through that rearing process. Because it's a good pollinator and it's easy to rear, we think it's actually a really good potential managed pollinator. And the interesting thing is it's a non-bee, so it's very rare that we use non-bees for crop pollination.
So the trials that you've been involved in, what has that involved? And what are the results? What has it shown about the efficacy, pros and cons of drone flies?
Okay, so drone flies we've known for quite a while now that they're very efficient pollinators. You think of your seed crops such as carrot and onion. Now, these crops which honeybees don't particularly like. If they have a chance, they'll go elsewhere. Droneflies actually really like those crops. Also, those crops are often grown as hybrid crops because the seed is much more valuable for the industry. Honeybees don't particularly like moving between lines in many of the hybrid systems. Droneflies will readily move across lines, so that provides them with an advantage in these really difficult to pollinate crops.
So why is that? I mean, I'm just quite interested. I mean, why would a honeybee not do that? Is it a behavioural thing?
Honeybees are very smart, and they've got the ability to communicate in their hive to other bees to choose what the best floral resource that they should visit. And so that's really developed in the bee. And so the bee is looking for pollen, it's looking for nectar. In a hybrid crop, you don't have pollen on the sterile line, so automatically it can differentiate between those. But it also can tell, by the types of sugars, what they like. It's a bit like choosing a pie for us. We might like a certain flavour, so we'll go to that one all the time. So bees are a bit like that. Droneflies generally are looking for nectar, and they're very opportunistic, so they'll just take whatever they can get. And so they're less fussy in terms of choosing between different plant species. So in a hybrid situation, that is actually a good important aspect of them to choose, that it doesn't choose between those hybrid lines.
So do you get an increase in seed yield because you've got droneflies pollinating your crop?
Yep, that should result. We haven't actually tested droneflies specifically, but basically all of the behaviour, and we know that in terms of putting pollen on stigmas, they're fantastic. So because they move more readily between the sterile and fertile line, they're going to put more pollen on the stigmas. So all of that is really important for pollination. In terms of looking at seed yield, that's one of our key tasks. And at the moment, our mass rearing is a way to be able to build up the numbers, and we can actually be able to tell the difference between, dronefly pollinated versus honeybee pollinated crops. So that's the next target.
So are they compatible? If you've got honeybees in your crop, and then and we decided you were going to have a managed dronefly pollination program, would they compromise each other?
Yeah, no. The thing with a mass flowering crop is that there's so much resource available all of a sudden that there's certainly enough to go around. And in some of the crops that we're looking at, carrot and onion, sometimes the problem is that we just don't get that many honeybees foraging on those crops. So we often see droneflies in particularly relatively high proportions to honeybees on those crops. An example was a crop last year in carrot that we did in the first year of the project, where we saw droneflies actually outnumbering honeybees on that crop. And that was early days in this experiment of mass rearing.
Yeah. So let's talk about the mass rearing. This is something that a lab would do and then give the pollinators to the grower, or is this something that the growers can actually do themselves? Okay,
what we want is the growers to be able to do this themselves. It's actually because they've got such a simple life cycle, and that we can go out and rear them en masse in the fields. It lends itself really well for the grower to actually take control and be able to be proactive in the pollination process. One of the key things is that we've been successful in mass rearing them in ditches or trenches at large numbers, and we've also been able to rear them in containers. Our next step is to have larger containers where we can control the conditions easily, and then the growers can move them around. And for an insect like this that doesn't sting, it means that a grower can easily just pick them up, move them wherever they want, to whatever field they want, as a managed pollinator. So it actually has a number of advantages over honeybees in that respect.
So this is a stupid question, I don't know, but do you have to seed the little trench with some flies first, or do they sort of naturally just colonise it?
Yeah. So in a region like Canterbury, drone flies are basically everywhere. So if you go out in your garden, even in the towns, there's a high probability you're going to come across a drone fly. So long as we provide the substrates that attract them, then we get really good visitation by female drone flies that will lay hundreds of eggs in the ditches. So we've had no problem in drawing them in.
So what do they like? I mean, what do you put in these wee trenches to attract them?
Yeah, basically they're very generalist in what they feed on. So they'll feed on decaying organic material, things like, just grass cuttings or broadleaf weeds. So this is what's really handy for a farm, is that a lot of the organic material that's available on the farm could be used to rear drone flies. They'll even feed on effluent, so you often see them in dairy farms. But basically anything in water that creates that decaying vegetation, they really like. So really flexible.
So have you been working on some farmers' properties when you've been doing these trials?
Yeah.
Have they sort of looked at and seen the results of the trials and thought, wow, I'm actually going to start doing that?
Yeah. Some of the growers are pretty excited, and they, without measuring seed yields, some of the farmers just automatically think it's better. We haven't really got proof of that, but farmers are very excited about it, and they believe that, these flies are giving them good results.
So what's the plan of attack then for the next year? I mean, this program is continuing.
Yeah.
And how do we get this out to more growers to actually start trying to just adopt this on farm?
Okay, so the final year, or the next year, will be focused on getting a really good practical method that farmers can easily see how to do it. And the idea is that we develop a manual, an easy-to-follow manual that growers can just take and use.
Or a video.
Sorry, what's that?
Or a video.
Or a video. Yeah, video is good. It's a very simple rearing process. So a grower shouldn't be scared about trialling it. So,
and it's not as if they have to invest a lot of money. It's not like financially a risky venture. It's very much a trial and see. And if it works on their farm, then they can just roll it out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ideally in the future, it would be fantastic to see these flies as being just as easy or easier to manage and cheaper to manage than honeybees. So the growers really have an option for a pollinator that can complement honeybees, or a pollinator by itself that can do the job that a honeybee does.
So you've specifically talked about drone flies being good for certain seed crops. Are there other insects that you're looking at that might be particularly good for a range of other crops?
Yeah. The sky's the limit in terms of a wide range of alternative pollinators. Difficulties arise in terms of their ability to rear them. So certain other hoverflies are actually got the benefit that they predate pest insects like aphids. But the thing is, to try and rear them, you need the aphids to start with. So the idea on some of those other insects is to develop systems that will support these other insects without specifically rearing a type. So manipulating semi-natural habitat that gets the most to the grower for that. So it might be that the grower is not, they've got a fence line that they're not particularly using for crop production, trying to make the most out of that by providing resources there that are going to look after the pollinator diversity on top of that, so that the growers not only have one or two pollinators that they rely on, they've got a background of pollinators that are all active at different times of the day, include efficient pollinating species that will pollinate the broad range of crops that they're growing. So that's sort of the vision.
Have growers in other countries been doing this? Are we sort of like slow off the mark? Or is this something that isn't relevant to other countries, or they've tried it and it hasn't worked?
Okay, in other countries, they have been doing floral strips, but the advantage that New Zealand has here is that we're at the point where we understand plant-insect interactions. So we know what pollinators to target, we know what plants they visit, we design the plantings to suit those pollinators that we know are going to pollinate our crops. So that's the difference of where we're at compared to other countries. Generally, it's plant out floral strips because flowers generally support pollinators.
Yeah.
But the way that we're going about it is that we can, design, okay, these plants, they'll flower at these times, they won't compete with the crop, they'll support the whole life cycle of the insect over the season, they're targeted at these specific pollinators, our bee species and our non-bee species, and we know that they pollinate a wide range of crops. So being really specific.
So it comes back to that sort of managed pollination rather than random pollination.
Yeah. And given that growers have only got a limited amount of land, trying to get the most out of that land that might be available for them that can provide those services that are really beneficial to the farm.
Yeah. So, honestly, I find this, I can't believe that we haven't been aware of this in the past. I'm presuming that alternative pollinator research has been around for years and years. Why are we only just starting to think about actively managing it on farm?
I think part of it is that, honeybees have been so relied on for a long period of time. Issues such as varroa have cropped up, and so when that happens, then suddenly the attention is drawn on, okay, is there anything else we can use? The other aspect is that a lot of research has been done in countries like Europe and North America. In those countries, bumblebees are particularly important. So there's been a lot of attention on those bees. There's been some attention on wild bees, but non-bees have been largely ignored. And in fact, a lot of the research in the southern hemisphere is leading the way on the non-bee pollinators, so the flies and the beetles and moths, things like that.
So do we have much understanding of the impact of pesticides that may be going onto those crops on the drone flies?
Yes, this is one of the issues. So when we think of products that growers might apply, often they have labels about, okay, don't apply at this certain time. Apply these because they've got a short life cycle. That they'll only be active for a short period of time. But this often ignores the non-bees. So often the non-bees are sheltering the crop. So the application of pesticide is an issue that needs to be considered. So trying to avoid that placement of pesticide. But that comes to the next stage of, okay, how are we going to manage these? Maybe we take, if it's really essential that pesticide needs to be applied, maybe we just pull out the containers where we're rearing the drone flies. So trying to make it as flexible as possible. But it's really important to know that pesticide interactions with bees don't necessarily mean that it's going to be the same issues with the other pollinating species.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. So is there anything else, any other little words of wisdom that you want to sort of let the growers know about the opportunity of looking at these alternative pollinators?
Yeah. So one of the things also I want to point out is the uncertainty around climate in the future, and that we know just relying on one pollinator, the honeybee, means that during periods of extreme weather, like really cool, cloudy, or extreme heat, that one insect can be active under a certain condition, but it's not going to meet, the requirements of a highly changeable climate. By creating that diversity, that helps make the system resilient.
Yeah, and that was actually the word I was going to use. It's all about, how do we create a more resilient ecosystem that allows farmers to address all of the climate change sort of factors and still be able to sort of manage their crops and get the sort of productive yield that they need. And if you're reliant on one thing, that makes you a very vulnerable system. And so building that resilience with more options is absolutely the way that we need to go.
And the other thing is it's also just on a well-being regard that, there's opportunities there to actually bring our native species to be actually productive in our agricultural system. So we're not only protecting our native species, we're also drawing them in to also help work for us as well. So there's a double benefit there.
Well, yeah, if you start putting a value on ecosystem services, suddenly you get a triple whammy, in that circumstance. So this is all exciting stuff for future research, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, it is a really exciting topic. What I really like is that there's so much room to move there. Like on this topic of alternative pollinators, there is just so much opportunity for growers to do more in the future by bringing in that understanding of the science and applying it, which we're trying to do with the drone flies, which we're trying to do with designing native habitat for the various diverse and native pollinators, then it's an exciting process of building that resilience and also ensuring that we lower the pollination deficits in crops as well. Actually,
before we finish off, quick question. So these pollinators, are they likely to be compatible with parasitoids and predators that people might want to introduce from an IPM perspective into a crop?
Yeah, and in fact, some of these insects are pollinators as well. They've got that dual benefit. So we talk about tachinids. Often tachinids are one insect that often gets introduced to control a specific pest species. Often the adults of those feed on pollen and nectar on the crops as well. And some of those are actually very effective pollinators. So double benefits there.
Absolutely. Oh, great stuff. Thank you very much, Brad. Really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's great to talk about it.
Yeah, excellent. And thank you to the listeners and have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.